There's this non-consensual act of sex that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 5 men have been victims of globally, but not many people know its name.
There is an alarming new sex trend.
There's a disturbing story to report with dangerous consequences.
It's without consent.
When a man secretly removes his condom in the middle of sex. Whoa. You guys, this is scary stuff.
It's called stealthing, and it is the secret removal of a condom during sex. On Thursday, October 7, the ACT became Australia's first state to criminalise stealthing. Only a few days later, California became America's first state to criminalise the act. And a few days after that, South Australia became our second state to push a bill to criminalise stealthing in the future. So I want to know what exactly stealthing is. Is it real rape? Why does nobody know about it? And why is it so bad that now jurisdictions around the globe are starting to criminalise it? Let's break it down.
Because it's scary. I mean, there is no way to prove that someone did this as well, and there is no legislation.
Dangerous trends, but this next one is downright despicable.
It's frankly unacceptable.
Stealthing is basically understood to be the non-consensual removal of a condom during sex, and it has been more openly spoken about in the last few years, with it anecdotally known to be confusing and violating, and commentators calling it vile. People wrote of experiencing sort of rape in 2015. An American civil rights attorney analysed the rape-adjacent act in academic papers 2 years later. Stealthing was portrayed on television screens and eventually entered courtrooms around the world for the very first time. But still, it has only been outlawed in legislation in a very small number of courts around the world. And now, Australia is one of them.
In closing, thank you, Madam Speaker. Stealthing is the non-consensual removal of a condom during sex.
Politician Elizabeth Lee led the Canberra Liberals' proposal to the ACT Legislative Assembly. That proposal saw consent legislation change in the state only a few days ago. Now, stealthing is explicitly criminalised in the ACT.
Madam Speaker, when I tabled the Crimes Stealthing Amendment Bill in April this year, I did so because I know that many people have experienced stealthing, but were unsure or aghast that our laws did not reflect community sentiment, that this is a heinous act that is a crime.
I got to talk to Lee about the nature of her bill and why it was so important for her to criminalise stealthing in writing.
The biggest concern that has been raised with me about stealthing is just the lack of certainty. A lot of the times, because the sexual intercourse itself was consented to, people sort of walk away with a feeling of, what was that? Was that okay? Was it not? And I think that's the biggest concern, because it weighs on your mind and you don't actually know whether you've been the victim of a sexual assault or not.
She explained how, without stealthing explicitly criminalised in legislation, it becomes ambiguous. Victims are unsure of whether what happened to them counts as sexual assault. And without clear sanctions that signal right from wrong, the wrong message might be sent to people who perpetrate the act.
You know, some people sort of distinguish between what's real rape and not. And that's why my law has been drafted in a very clear way to say that the removal or the non-use of a condom without consent of that action negates consent itself to the act of sex. And we all know that if you don't have consent for sex, then that is rape, and that needs to be made clearer.
I also wanted to better understand the act of stealthing in the broader context of sexual assault, so I spoke to a sexual violence researcher, Dr Bianca Fileborn from the University of Melbourne.
Stealthing itself is a relatively new term, although I'm sure the behaviour itself has been happening for a very long time. It's really only in the past few years that the concept of stealthing has kind of come into public discourse or public conversations around sexual consent. People have really lacked the language to actually express the harms of stealthing or to even articulate it as a form of sexual violence. And then alongside that, we have these broader, long-standing myths and misperceptions around what sexual violence is. Stealthing doesn't really fit within that misperception, right, of what real rape is.
This idea of real rape is an important one. Politician Lee comes back to it, and the misperceptions that surround it all being part of why so many people don't understand stealthing.
I think that broadly speaking, sexual assaults and sex-related crimes have always been very complex and tricky, and part of that is because of the long-term stigma that's attached to reporting of these types of horrendous incidents, and that has stopped people from publicly talking about it. And a lot of the times it happens with somebody that you trust, like implicitly. Most people sort of think rape and they think dark alleyway, some stranger coming up and very violently doing something. And we know that vast majority of sexual assaults do not occur that way. That makes it difficult when you're trying to make sure that people realise consent has to be freely given, and it's got to be an affirmative sort of type of action. So there is a disconnect in that regard, and that's what makes it difficult.
It was hearing the personal experiences of victims that helped Lee understand the severity of stealthing and its consequences, and prompted her to address this in policy change.
About the impact of her experience, and I quote, "You feel your free will has been taken away." She went on to say, and I quote, "absolutely shaken her trust in men and undermined her sense of sexual autonomy."
Dr. Fileborn explained to me something similar. Why stealthing is such a violating experience. And it comes down to one person's autonomy and bodily control being completely stripped away because another person felt the entitlement to do so.
It's a huge violation of trust. Sex is incredibly vulnerable, and we're putting a huge amount of trust in the other person. So to then remove a condom without someone's knowledge or without, having a conversation about them first, massive violation of trust. It's a violation of your body. On a more basic level, it can raise concerns around things like unwanted pregnancies, STIs, HIV. It's directly putting at risk the health and well-being of the other person. I think it can hugely shatter someone's, belief in the world as a good place, your ability to trust other people.
She acknowledged that some men who perpetrate the act fall back on the excuse of sexual pleasure, saying that penetrative sex feels better without a condom. But her research shows that isn't necessarily the whole truth.
Ultimately, I think it comes down to, power, control, and entitlement. So, this sense that as a man, you are entitled to sexually access other people's bodies in the way that you choose. It's the idea that you have some kind of right to sexually access other people, and that, their feelings or thoughts or what they want are somehow less important than your own. And I think it's certainly enabled by men being in a position of power. But I think it's also an act to gain power as well.
Understood is that this behaviour towards consent and sexual assault is all a part of a broader rape culture that we see in our schools, workplaces, social groups, online, even in our Australian Parliament.
Particularly groups of men coming together and normalising sexual violence is really concerning. So there's a body of work or a theory called male peer support, which is basically the idea that, groups of men will support each other and normalise and excuse sexual violence. Men are coming together and saying, oh, that's fine, that doesn't count as rape, or, encouraging other men to engage in these types of behaviours. And that works to perhaps make perpetrators or potential perpetrators feel that this behaviour is normal, it's excusable, they're just doing what their peers are doing. Its social contexts can be really powerful in normalising and embedding these attitudes that underpin sexual violence.
And that normalised rape culture feeds into the stigma around speaking up about it. Australia saw that blow up this year.
behavior that is clearly unacceptable has sort of been brushed off as, oh, boys will be boys, that type of mentality. I do think that our society is on the cusp of changing that culture, and part of that is obviously the movement that we saw happen earlier this year, that was very, very powerful and went all around the country. And the most stark thing about that movement when it was sparked was it took one very courageous woman to come out and speak about the experience. But the fact that it resonated with so many women, across the country and perhaps around the world, just goes to show the anger, the frustration, and the sheer desperation that many women were feeling and probably hiding because of that stigma where they don't want to speak up.
It took major watershed movements over the last few years to get us to this point. Internationally, we saw the Me Too movement. In Australia, landmark cases have really put discussion of consent on the table. Looking at Brittany Higgins, Chanel Contos, Grace Tame and their efforts, we know there has been a groundswell of critical moments in Australia's consent discourse over the past few years. Dr Fileborn sees this prolonged national conversation around consent, but she fears that it may be forgotten. She knows that changing a law cannot be the end of this discussion, especially if beyond that, not enough is being done to sustain it.
So we've had decades of really quite progressive, in some cases, law reform and procedural reforms in jurisdictions across Australia. And unfortunately, there's been absolutely no change in things like rates of reporting to police. There's been very little change in terms of the experiences of survivors who go through the criminal justice system. So it's routinely still an incredibly traumatic experience. We need, particularly people in our parliaments, our state and federal parliaments, to take responsibility for leading this conversation and for actually providing the resources that are needed to ensure that we have prolonged, policy and action in place, making sure that there is comprehensive sex education in schools, making sure that that crisis services and services that are working with perpetrators are adequately funded. If we're serious about combating this as an issue, we need to be putting the resources in. We are making progress, but it is very slow and challenging. And it would be fantastic to see people in positions of power really taking responsibility for leading this conversation and for making a change.